Inside, Sun Yat-sen, a saint and a demon tore each other apart for a lifetime. The saint was a doctor, an idealist. He dreamed of a China without emperors, a republic built on freedom and hope. His dream was pure. But the demon was a conspirator, a ruthless pragmatist. It knew that to build heaven, you first had to set hell ablaze. That demon shook hands with triads, whispered promises to bloodthirsty warlords, and took money from anyone, no matter how stained with filth their hands were. The saint provided the dream. The demon committed the crimes to make it a reality. And that was the final tragedy of Sun Yat-sen. The demon succeeded in destroying the old world, but its brutal methods also poisoned the very dream the saint wanted to build. He freed China from a dragon, only to leave it to a pack of wolves. To truly comprehend the fire that burned within Sun Yat-sen, one must first walk through the ashes of the world that created him. The China of his birth in 1866 was not the glorious celestial empire of poetry and legend. It was a colossal ruin, a magnificent dragon bleeding from 1,000 wounds, its scales tarnished, and its roar reduced to a wheezing gasp. The ruling Qing dynasty, a dynasty of Manchu outsiders who had conquered the Han Chinese heartland 2 centuries prior, was a hollowed-out husk. Its authority, once absolute and divinely ordained, had been systematically shattered, not by internal decay alone, but by the deafening roar of Western cannons. The nightmare had begun decades earlier, with a substance as seductive as it was destructive: opium. British merchants, seeking to reverse a crippling trade deficit caused by their insatiable demand for Chinese tea and silk, flooded the port of Canton with narcotics grown in their Indian colonies. The social and economic devastation was immediate and catastrophic. Millions became addicts, their ambition and health dissolving in the sweet-smelling smoke of the opium pipe. The nation's silver reserves, once the bedrock of its economy, bled out to pay for the foreign poison. When the Daoguang Emperor finally moved to stamp out the trade in 1839, appointing the incorruptible Commissioner Lin Zexu to seize and destroy over 20,000 chests of British opium, he did not trigger a renewal of Chinese strength. He lit the fuse on a bomb that would blow the gates of his ancient empire off their hinges. The British response was swift, brutal, and technologically overwhelming. The First Opium War was not a war, it was a dissection. British steam-powered gunships, impervious to Chinese currents and winds, sailed up rivers with impunity, their advanced artillery pulverizing coastal forts that had stood for centuries. The Qing military, equipped with antiquated matchlock rifles and a medieval understanding of warfare, was annihilated. The Treaty of Nanking in 1842 was the first of the great humiliations. It was a treaty signed at gunpoint, forcing China to cede Hong Kong to Britain, open 5 ports to foreign trade, and pay a massive indemnity that would cripple its treasury for years. Most gallingly, it forced China to accept the very opium trade it had fought to extinguish. This was only the beginning. The dragon, once wounded, was now surrounded by predators. A second opium war, a slew of other conflicts, and the relentless pressure of foreign diplomats, missionaries, and merchants led to a series of unequal treaties. More ports were opened, more indemnities paid. Foreigners were granted extraterritoriality, meaning they were exempt from Chinese law. A German could murder a Chinese citizen in the streets of Shanghai and be tried by a lenient German consul, not a Chinese magistrate. Foreign powers carved out concessions in major cities, enclaves of foreign architecture, law, and arrogance, where Chinese were often treated as second-class citizens in their own country. The signs at the entrance to a Shanghai park infamously, and perhaps apocryphally, though the sentiment was real, read "No dogs and Chinese allowed." This was not just a political or economic crisis, it was a spiritual apocalypse. The Middle Kingdom, the center of the civilized world for millennia, was being carved up like a common melon by barbarians from beyond the seas. But the sickness was not just external. Internally, the empire was rotting from the core. The Manchu rulers, though they had adopted Chinese culture, were still viewed by many among the vast Han Chinese majority as foreign occupiers. This ethnic tension was a fault line running deep beneath the foundations of the state. Corruption was endemic, a cancer that had metastasized from the lowest village yamen to the gilded halls of the Forbidden City. Officials bought their posts, then squeezed the peasantry dry to recoup their investment and enrich themselves. The intricate system of canals and dikes, which had for centuries controlled China's great rivers and irrigated its farmlands, fell into disrepair through neglect and graft, leading to cycles of devastating floods and famines. Into this maelstrom of decay erupted the single most destructive civil war in human history, the Taiping Rebellion. It was not a simple peasant uprising. It was a messianic, quasi-Christian, holy war of breathtaking ambition and unimaginable violence. Its leader, Hong Zhuquan, was a failed scholar who, after a nervous breakdown, declared himself to be the younger brother of Jesus Christ, sent to earth to slay demons and establish a heavenly kingdom of great peace. The demons he identified were the Manchu rulers. For 14 years, the Taiping armies tore across southern China, capturing the great city of Nanjing and making it their capital. They were a force of radical, brutal change, instituting a form of primitive communism, segregating the sexes, and banning opium, alcohol, and tobacco. The Qing dynasty, helpless to stop them, was forced to rely on regional Han Chinese armies, sowing the seeds of future warlordism. By the time the rebellion was finally crushed with the help of Western military advisors, an estimated 20 to 30 million people were dead. The richest provinces of the empire were depopulated, their cities smoldering ruins. The psychic scar left on the nation was immeasurable. The war had proven two things with terrifying clarity. The Qing government was impotent to protect its people, and millions of ordinary Chinese were so desperate, so utterly broken by their circumstances, that they would flock to the banner of a madman claiming to be Christ's brother just for a glimmer of hope. For the vast majority of the 400 million souls trapped in this collapsing world, life was a desperate Hobbesian struggle for survival. The peasant, the backbone of the nation for millennia, was ground into the dust. He was bound by the eternal cycle of the seasons, yet his fate was controlled by forces far beyond his comprehension. A voice from the fields might have lamented, "The emperor is in Beijing. He is as far away as the sun. Heaven is high, and the emperor is far. We see only the tax collector. We see only the landlord. They take the grain before it is grown, the son before he is a man. We are born in bitterness. We eat bitterness, and we die in dust." This was the world of dust and decay, of humiliation and rage, into which Sun Wen, later known as Sun Yat-sen, was born in the southern coastal village of Qing, Guangdong, in 1866. He was born just 2 years after the end of the Taiping Rebellion, into a landscape haunted by its ghosts and a nation suffocating under the weight of its own past. From his very first breath, he inhaled the air of a sick and dying empire. And from his earliest days, he felt its injustice not as an abstract political theory, but as an ache in his stomach and the permanent exhaustion etched on his father's face. Qing was a world away from the political machinations of Beijing, yet it was on the front lines of China's collision with the West. Guangdong province was the historic gateway for foreign trade and ideas. The nearby port of Macau was a centuries-old Portuguese colony, and Hong Kong, a bustling British one. The people of this region were known for their independent, enterprising, and often rebellious spirit. They were among the first to emigrate, forming diasporas across Southeast Asia and the Americas. The stories they sent back of gold mountains in California and strange customs in the flowery flag country were a constant, unsettling whisper of a world beyond the rice paddies. Sun's family were poor tenant farmers, perpetually in debt to a landlord in a neighboring village. They did not own the land they tilled. Life was a precarious balancing act, dictated by the harvest, the price of rice, and the whims of the tax collector. Yet, Sun's childhood was also filled with stories that planted the seeds of rebellion in his fertile mind. He would sit for hours, mesmerized, listening to an old Taiping soldier recount tales of the war against the Manchus. To the Qing government, these men were bandits and heretics. To the young Sun, they were Han Chinese heroes who had dared to fight the foreign occupiers. He absorbed their tales of battle, of hope, and of ultimate tragic failure. The dream of overthrowing the Manchus was not an invention of his adult mind. It was a childhood fantasy, nurtured by the hushed, bitter stories of defeated rebels. His formal education was a study in contradictions. In the village school, he was made to memorize and recite the Confucian classics, the ancient texts that had formed the bedrock of Chinese society for 2 millennia. He learned of filial piety, of respect for hierarchy, of the rigid social order where the scholar official ruled and the peasant obeyed. The message was clear: know your place, honor the past, and obey the Son of Heaven in Beijing. But when Sun looked outside the schoolhouse door, he saw a world that made a mockery of these beautiful, ordered principles. He saw superstition and fear holding his people in chains. He saw villagers praying to idols for rain while their crops withered, consulting fortune tellers for illness while their children died. He saw a profound disconnect between the high-minded philosophy of the classics and the grim, stagnant reality of village life. The breaking point, his first true act of revolution, came when he was a teenager. It was an act of audacious, almost reckless defiance, filled with a young man's contempt for the old ways he saw as a trap. He and his childhood friend, Lu Haodong, marched into the village temple dedicated to Beidi, the northern emperor. In front of stunned villagers, Sun grabbed the statue of the deity, broke off its finger, and declared, "This God is powerless to protect even himself. How can he protect you?" He then proceeded to damage other idols in the temple. This was not mere youthful vandalism. It was his first surgical procedure as a doctor of the nation. The idol was not the disease, it was a symptom. The true sickness was the fear that kept his people kneeling before it. In that act of blasphemy, he was attempting to break not just a clay statue, but the invisible chains of superstition that bound his people to a cycle of poverty and despair. The village elders were horrified. To save face and protect their son from the wrath of the community, Sun's parents did the only thing they could. They exiled him, sending him on a steamship to join his elder brother, Sun Mei, in a place that might as well have been another planet, Honolulu, in the Kingdom of Hawaii. The journey itself was a revelation. For the first time, he saw the awesome power of Western technology in the form of a massive steam-powered ship. When he arrived in Hawaii in 1879, it was a profound culture shock that would permanently rewire his brain. Hawaii was a crossroads of East and West, a society in rapid transition. But for Sun, it was primarily a classroom in modernity. His brother, who had become a successful merchant and rancher, enrolled him in the prestigious Iolani School, an Anglican institution that educated the sons of the Hawaiian elite. Suddenly, the boy who had chanted Confucian classics was immersed in the English language, in mathematics, science, British history, and most transformative of all, Christianity. He read about the Magna Carta and the principles of constitutional monarchy. He learned of the scientific method, a way of understanding the world based on evidence and reason, not superstition. He was surrounded by Western concepts of law, of individual rights, and of a government that was accountable to its people. Every day was a lesson in the vast and growing power gap between the West and his homeland. He saw order, infrastructure, and a dynamic economy. He saw a world built not on ancient rights but on modern principles. The spark of defiance that had led him to break an idol in Qing was now fanned into a steady flame of intellectual awakening. He excelled in his studies, received a prize for his English grammar from King Kalakaua, and began to embrace Christianity, seeing in its teachings a moral and spiritual force for progress that he found lacking in the fatalism of traditional Chinese religion. After 3 years at Iolani and further studies at Oahu College, his transformation was so profound that it alarmed his brother. When Sun announced his intention to be baptized, Sun Mei, fearing he was abandoning his heritage entirely, cut off his school fees and sent him back to Qing in 1883. But it was too late. The boy who had left was gone forever. In his place stood a young man whose mind now straddled two different worlds. He returned to a China that seemed more stagnant, more backward, more suffocating than ever before. He saw his village with new eyes, and he was horrified. He resumed his war against superstition, this time destroying more idols and infuriating the village elders, once again, forcing him to flee to the sanctuary of British-controlled Hong Kong. The journey out had ignited his mind. The journey back had broken his heart and solidified his purpose. He could no longer simply live in China. He had to save it. In Hong Kong, Sun made a choice that would define the next stage of his life. He decided to study medicine. It was a practical profession, and one deeply imbued with the prestige of Western science. He enrolled in the Canton Hospital and later transferred to the Hong Kong College of Medicine for Chinese, the forerunner of the University of Hong Kong. He was a brilliant and dedicated student, graduating in 1892 as one of the first 2 students in the college's history. His mentor was the esteemed Scottish doctor, Sir James Cantley, who would later play a pivotal role in saving his life. For a time, Sun practiced medicine in Macau and Canton. He was a good doctor, respected for his modern techniques and compassionate care. He could have lived a comfortable, prosperous life as one of China's first Western-trained physicians. But his true patient was not a person with a fever or a broken bone. It was the nation itself, a 400 million strong behemoth racked with the cancer of corruption, the fever of foreign oppression, and the paralysis of tradition. He saw his daily work as a metaphor. He could set a bone, but he could not mend a broken society. He could excise a tumor, but he could not cut out the rot of the Qing dynasty. His frustration grew with every patient he treated, as he would later famously say, "I was a doctor, but I soon realized that a doctor could only save a few lives, while a revolution could save millions." He had made his diagnosis. The Qing dynasty was not just sick, it was a terminal case. Its disease was not merely political incompetence or military weakness. The disease was the entire imperial system itself, its sclerotic Confucian bureaucracy, its deeply ingrained corruption, its xenophobic resistance to fundamental change, and its Manchu identity, which made it an alien regime to the Han majority. The self-strengthening movement, a period of limited reforms, where the court had tried to adopt Western technology without adopting Western political ideas, had been exposed as a failure. It was like trying to put a modern jet engine on a medieval ox cart. The ox cart would simply shatter. The only solution, Sun concluded, was radical surgery. The entire dynastic system had to be removed. In its place, a modern republic had to be born. Yet even then, he made one last attempt at a peaceful cure. In 1894, leveraging his status as a Western-educated professional, he traveled north to Tianjin. He sought an audience with Li Hongzhang, the most powerful official in the Qing court, a leading architect of the self-strengthening movement. Sun prepared a long, eloquent petition, a detailed proposal for national salvation. He did not explicitly call for revolution. Instead, he argued passionately for a program of modernization based on 4 key pillars: making the best use of human talent, developing agriculture, exploiting natural resources, and ensuring the smooth circulation of goods. He argued that China's strength lay not in acquiring more gunboats, but in developing its people, its education system, and its economy. It was a brilliant, forward-thinking manifesto for reform. He never got the meeting. Li Hongzhang, preoccupied with the looming threat of war with Japan, considered Sun a minor and irrelevant figure with outlandish ideas. The petition was received by a low-level aide and promptly filed away, ignored. Sun was dismissed without even the courtesy of a reply. For Sun Yat-sen, this was the moment the world turned. The doors of peaceful change, the doors of reform from within, had been unceremoniously slammed in his face. He had tried to offer a cure, but the patient was too arrogant and too sick to even listen. He left Tianjin a changed man. The hopeful reformer was dead. In his place was a hardened revolutionary. If the Qing dynasty would not allow itself to be cured, then it would have to be killed. The path of the physician was over. The path of the rebel, the exile, the ghost who would haunt the empire to its grave, had begun. That same year, the First Sino-Japanese War broke out. The humiliating defeat of China's modernized navy by the much smaller but more thoroughly westernized Japanese fleet proved Sun's diagnosis correct. The Qing dynasty was incurable. As the war raged, Sun traveled back to Honolulu, the place of his intellectual birth. There, on November 24, 1894, he gathered a small group of like-minded Cantonese expatriates and founded his first revolutionary organization, the Revive China Society. Their oath was simple, secret, and treasonous: expel the Manchu barbarians, restore China to the Chinese, and establish a federal republic. The surgeon had picked up his scalpel. The revolution had begun. With the founding of the Revive China Society, the clock began to tick on Sun Yat-sen's first audacious gamble. The physician's diagnosis was complete. Now came the surgeon's first terrifying incision. The plan was as simple as it was dangerous: to seize Canton, the provincial capital of his home province, and use it as a base to ignite a nationwide uprising. Returning to Hong Kong in early 1895, Sun established a clandestine headquarters disguised as a business called the Qianheng Company. The revolutionaries were a motley collection of idealists, Christian converts, members of secret societies like the Triads, who harbored a long-standing hatred for the Manchus, patriotic students, and overseas Chinese merchants who funneled money into the cause. They were bound not by experience, but by a shared, burning conviction that the Qing dynasty had to fall. The plan was set for October 26, 1895, timed to coincide with the Chongyang Festival. The strategy relied on a two-pronged attack. Sun would lead a force of revolutionaries from Hong Kong, while another group inside Canton would rise up simultaneously. They purchased a few hundred pistols and recruited a small force of dare-to-die volunteers. Their flag, designed by Sun's childhood friend Lu Haodong, was a stark and potent symbol, a white sun on a blue sky, representing the dawn of a new China. Everything about the operation felt raw, amateurish, and fueled by a desperate, youthful passion. It was a conspiracy whispered in the back rooms of Hong Kong, a dream sketched on paper about to collide with the brutal reality of state power. The collision was catastrophic. The Qing government, while decadent, was not deaf. Its network of informants was vast. Just days before the planned uprising, the plot was betrayed. A local official received a detailed tip-off, and the authorities moved with ruthless efficiency. One of Sun's key organizers was arrested, and under torture he revealed everything. The police raided the revolutionary cells scattered across Canton, seizing weapons, documents, and the blue and white Sun flags. The element of surprise was gone. The plan was not just compromised, it was shattered. Sun, waiting in Hong Kong with his contingent, received the devastating news. The shipment of arms he had arranged had been delayed, and now government patrols swarmed the waterways between the colony and the mainland. The uprising was aborted before it could even begin. A frantic scramble for survival ensued. Most of the plotters scattered and went into hiding, but not all were so lucky. The Qing authorities arrested over 70 people, including Lu Haodong. Lu's fate would become the first great martyrdom of the revolution. He was a quiet artist, not a hardened soldier, the friend who had stood beside Sun years ago when they defaced the village idols. Captured while trying to destroy a roster of the society's members to protect their identities, he was interrogated and brutally tortured. The magistrate, seeking the whereabouts of Sun Yat-sen, demanded to know who his co-conspirators were. Lu Haodong refused to speak. Before his execution, he penned a final defiant statement that would echo through the revolutionary movement for years to come. I am one of the first to be willing to sacrifice my life for the cause of pulling China out of the abyss of misery. Though I am dying, my belief is stronger than ever. But you can kill me and my comrades today. You will never be able to kill all the comrades in the future. They will rise up wave after wave. The cause of revolution will eventually succeed. He was executed by beheading, his blood the first of many drops that would be spilled for Sun's dream. Sun Yat-sen barely escaped with his life. With a price of 1,000 silver taels placed on his head by the Qing government, he became a wanted man, a fugitive. He fled from Hong Kong to Macau, then to Japan, and eventually made his way to Hawaii and then America. The uprising was a military disaster, but it was a spiritual triumph. It had cost the life of his dearest friend. It had branded him a failure and a traitor in the eyes of the establishment. But in failure, a crucial lesson was learned. Revolution was not a matter of simple conspiracy. It required organization, funding, international support, and an almost inhuman level of perseverance. The failure of 1895 did not extinguish the fire in Sun Yat-sen. It tempered it into hard steel. He was no longer just a plotter. He was now a ghost, a political specter with a price on his head, beginning a 16-year odyssey in exile, haunting the Chinatowns of the world to raise the funds and forces necessary to try again. After the Canton fiasco, Sun's journey took him to London in 1896. He was there to study the political and economic systems of the European powers, hoping to distill their secrets of success for a future Chinese republic. He was an obscure figure, a failed rebel from a distant land, living in modest lodgings, and spending his days in the reading room of the British Museum, the same room where Karl Marx had written Das Kapital. To the British public, he was invisible. But to the agents of the Qing dynasty, he was a dangerous fugitive who had slipped through their grasp. The Chinese legation in London, the official embassy of the Qing Empire, was given a clear directive: capture Sun Yat-sen and ship him back to China to face the executioner's blade. The plot was orchestrated with insidious patience. The legation hired private detectives to track Sun's movements. They learned his routines, his address, and the route he took to visit his friends, including his former medical mentor, James Cantley. On Sunday, October 11, 1896, as Sun walked past the Chinese legation on his way to see the Cantleys for lunch, the trap was sprung. He was approached by a fellow countryman who struck up a polite conversation, asking if he was Chinese or Japanese. As they spoke, two other men joined them, and with unnerving civility, they guided the unsuspecting Sun through the open doors of the legation. The moment he was inside, the heavy doors swung shut. The polite smiles vanished. Sun was seized, dragged up a flight of stairs, and thrown into a locked room on the top floor. He was a prisoner of the Qing Empire on British soil. His initial confusion quickly turned to icy terror. His captors, led by the English Secretary of the Legation, Sir Halliday Macartney, informed him of his fate. A ship had been chartered for £7,000. He would be smuggled aboard in a specially designed crate, disguised as diplomatic cargo, and shipped back to China. There, he would be made an example of. He would face lynching, the infamous death by 1,000 cuts, a slow and agonizing execution reserved for the worst of traitors. For days, Sun was held in solitary confinement. The room was his cage, London his tormentor. Through the barred window, he could see the oblivious life of a great free city unfolding below, the horse-drawn carriages, the pedestrians hurrying about their business, while he sat, a condemned man awaiting a horrific death thousands of miles away. Despair began to set in. He was utterly alone, cut off from the world, his grand revolutionary dream destined to end in a dark, anonymous room in Belgravia. But the revolutionary's will to survive was formidable. He began to look for any possible means of escape. He tried to toss out coins wrapped in notes, hoping someone would find them. They were found by his captors. He scribbled desperate pleas on scraps of paper and threw them from the window, but they were swept away by the autumn wind. His hope rested on a single fragile possibility: getting a message to James Cantley. He began to work on his British guards, two men named Cole and Burton, appealing to their sense of justice and, more pragmatically, offering them a large reward. He managed to convince Cole to get a message to his former landlady, who he hoped would alert Dr. Cantley. The message was intercepted. His final hope seemed to be his cleaning lady. He wrote a desperate note, disguised as a social letter, and pleaded with her to deliver it. It is unclear if this note ever made it. His true salvation came from a more direct approach. After days of working on them, he finally broke through to his guard, Cole, and the legation's British servant, George Scale. He explained his situation, emphasizing that his abduction was an illegal act on British soil and appealing to their Christian morality. He promised them a reward of £1,000. He wrote a note on a torn-off page of a book and a visiting card, which Scale and Cole managed to sneak out and deliver to James Cantley's residence late on the night of Saturday, October 17th. The news hit Cantley like a thunderbolt. He immediately understood the mortal danger his former student was in. What followed was a frantic, desperate race against time. Cantley rushed to Scotland Yard, but the police were skeptical and slow to act, wary of violating diplomatic immunity. He went to the Foreign Office, where bureaucrats concerned with maintaining good relations with China were similarly hesitant. Cantley was met with disbelief and institutional inertia. The official machinery of the British state was moving too slowly. The ship to take Sun to his death could arrive at any moment. Realizing that official channels were failing, Cantley made a brilliant strategic decision. He would fight a diplomatic conspiracy with a public outcry. He took the story to the press. On October 22nd, the London newspaper The Globe published the explosive story under the headline, "An Outrage in London. A Chinese reformer kidnapped at the embassy." The story was electric. It was a tale straight out of a Victorian thriller, a foreign despotism operating with impunity in the heart of London, a political refugee held captive, the principles of British liberty and justice at stake. As one contemporary journalist might have observed, it was an extraordinary affair. The story captured the public imagination overnight. This wasn't just about one man, it was about the principles of liberty. Suddenly, everyone in London was talking about this Sun Yat-sen. He was transformed from a nobody into a cause célèbre. The public furor was immense. Newspapers across the country picked up the story. Questions were asked in Parliament. Crowds began to gather outside the Chinese legation, chanting and demanding Sun's release. The British government, under intense public and political pressure, could no longer prevaricate. Prime Minister Lord Salisbury issued a stern warning to the Chinese ambassador: release your prisoner, or the entire legation staff would be expelled from the country. Checkmated and humiliated, the Qing officials had no choice. On October 23rd, after 12 terrifying days of captivity, Sun Yat-sen was released. He walked out of the legation door not as a failed and forgotten rebel, but as an international hero, his name known across the Western world. The Qing dynasty had tried to silence a dissident. Instead, they had created a global icon for their opposition and handed him a megaphone. The London kidnapping was the single most important event in forging Sun's international reputation, a spectacular own goal by the Manchu regime that gave him the fame and moral authority he would need for the long, bloody struggle ahead. Freed from the Chinese legation, Sun Yat-sen was a changed man. He was no longer just a fugitive, but a symbol. He capitalized on his newfound fame, quickly publishing a book, Kidnapped in London, which detailed his ordeal and articulated his vision for a reformed China. He had discovered a powerful new weapon, public opinion. For the next decade, his life became a relentless, globe-trotting quest, a perpetual campaign to rally the forces and raise the funds for revolution. He was the heart, soul, and chief fundraiser of the movement, a wandering ghost whose home was a steamship cabin or a Spartan room in a Chinatown boarding house. His primary target was the vast and growing Chinese diaspora. These were the millions of Huaqiao, the overseas Chinese who had left their homeland to escape poverty and turmoil, seeking their fortunes in the cities and plantations of Southeast Asia, the goldfields of America, and the businesses of Japan. They were a people living between two worlds, often facing discrimination in their adopted countries while harboring a deep emotional connection to a homeland they remembered as weak and humiliated. Sun Yat-sen tapped into this deep well of patriotic resentment and hope. His travels were encyclopedic in their scope. He moved through Japan, where he would find his most crucial intellectual and organizational support. He journeyed through French Indochina, Siam, British Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. He crossed the Pacific multiple times, speaking in the Chinatowns of Honolulu, San Francisco, Vancouver, and Denver. The scene would often be the same. Sun, a slight man dressed in a sharp Western suit, would stand before an audience of laundrymen, grocers, laborers, and merchants. He would speak not in the flowery prose of a Confucian scholar, but with the direct, passionate urgency of a modern evangelist. He spoke of the rotten Manchus, igniting the embers of Han ethnic nationalism. He recounted the national humiliations, the opium wars, the unequal treaties, the foreign soldiers marching through Beijing. He painted a grim picture of a China being carved up like a melon, its people enslaved and its future bleak. Then he would pivot, offering a vision of a new China, a republic strong, prosperous, and respected on the world stage, a China where their families back home would no longer suffer from famine and corruption. He was selling a dream, an investment in national redemption, and he would ask them to pay for it. He collected donations, sold revolutionary bonds to be redeemed after the Qing fell, and recruited young men into his secret societies. It was a slow, grueling process, building a revolution dollar by dollar, convert by convert, in the back alleys of a global diaspora. The most significant step in this organizational odyssey took place in Tokyo in August 1905. Japan had become a sanctuary for Chinese dissidents and radical students, especially after its stunning victory over Russia, which proved that an Asian nation could defeat a European great power through modernization. In Tokyo, Sun managed to achieve what had previously been impossible. He united the disparate, often rival anti-Qing revolutionary groups into a single, cohesive organization. This was the Tongmenghui, or the United League. It was a government in exile, a revolutionary party with a clear structure, and for the first time, a coherent ideology. At the heart of the Tongmenghui's platform were Sun's three principles of the people, the political philosophy he had been refining throughout his exile. The first was Minzu, nationalism, not just overthrowing the foreign Manchu dynasty, but also resisting Western imperialism and creating a unified Chinese national identity. The second was Minqian, often translated as democracy, or the people's power, establishing a republic with a constitution and a popularly elected government, modeled on the systems he had studied in America and Europe. The third was Minsheng, the people's livelihood, a vague but powerful form of social welfare and economic justice, aimed at ensuring the land was owned by those who tilled it and preventing the vast inequalities he saw in Western capitalism. These three principles became the ideological bedrock of the Chinese Revolution, a powerful and appealing alternative to the decaying imperial system. The Tongmenghui was Sun's greatest political achievement to date, transforming a scattered collection of plotters into a disciplined revolutionary party with a shared vision for the future. With a new organization and a steady, if modest, stream of funding from overseas, Sun and the Tongmenghui launched a new wave of attacks against the Qing. The decade from 1900 to 1911 was a period of relentless, bloody, and ultimately unsuccessful uprisings. Sun Yat-sen, the master strategist and fundraiser, typically planned the revolts from afar, in Japan or Hanoi, while his most trusted military commander, the charismatic and courageous Huang Xing, would lead the men on the ground. They orchestrated 10 major uprisings in this period. Every single one failed. Each failure was its own unique story of immense courage, poor coordination, bad luck, and heartbreaking loss. There was the Jianguan uprising in 1907, where Sun himself was present on the front lines, personally firing an artillery piece at Qing positions from across the Vietnamese border before the revolt collapsed from lack of supplies. There were multiple attempts to seize territory in Guangdong, Guangxi, and Yunnan, all of which were brutally suppressed. The Qing state, however weak, still possessed a professional, modern-trained army that consistently crushed the small, ill-equipped bands of revolutionaries. The voice of a typical revolutionary from this period, writing in a secret letter to his family, might capture the mood of desperate hope. We have lost more brothers. The papers in Hong Kong call us failures, bandits. They do not see that each drop of our blood is a seed that waters the soil of our homeland. Dr. Sun tells us this. He is far away, but his words are a fire in our hearts. We fail, and we fail again, but we will not stop. To die for this cause is not to die in vain. It is to become an ancestor to a nation yet unborn. The most legendary of these noble failures was the Guangzhou uprising of April 27, 1911, an event that would be seared into the mythology of the revolution. It was the Tongminghui's best planned, best funded, and most ambitious attempt yet. Huang Xing led a vanguard of several hundred dare-to-die commandos in a direct assault on the government headquarters in Canton. They were breathtakingly brave, but the plan fell apart due to poor coordination between different units. The expected reinforcements never materialized. What was meant to be a decisive uprising devolved into a day of bloody street fighting. Huang Xing and his men were overwhelmed by the superior numbers of the Qing army. Huang himself was wounded, losing 2 fingers, but managed to escape. The aftermath was grim. The Qing authorities scoured the city, executing anyone suspected of involvement. They recovered the bodies of 72 of the slain revolutionaries and buried them in a mass grave on Yellow Flower Mound outside the city. This defeat was, in military terms, a complete disaster, but in propaganda terms, it was a stunning victory. The story of the 72 martyrs of Yellow Flower Mound became a powerful symbol of selfless sacrifice. Many of them were young students who had returned from overseas, abandoning comfortable lives to die for China. Their farewell letters to their families were published and circulated, inspiring a new wave of anti-Qing sentiment across the country. They had failed to capture a city, but they had successfully captured the hearts and minds of a generation. The constant failures, far from demoralizing the populace, were beginning to have a cumulative effect. Each martyrdom was a hammer blow against the legitimacy of the Manchu regime, proving that there were men willing to die again and again for the dream of a new China. The revolution was an all-consuming obsession, a jealous God that demanded total devotion. For Sun Yat-sen, this meant the sacrifice of anything resembling a normal life. His existence was one of constant movement, of perpetual danger, of living out of a suitcase and sleeping with the knowledge that assassins could be waiting around any corner. This single-minded focus came at an immense personal cost, a cost borne largely by the women and children in his life. His first wife, Lu Muzhen, was a traditional, uneducated woman from a neighboring village, chosen for him by his family in an arranged marriage. She bore him a son, Sun Fo, and 2 daughters, but she was the wife of a ghost. For years at a time, she would not see or hear from her husband. He was a distant figure, a name in a newspaper, a source of constant danger for the family he left behind. She lived a life of anxiety and hardship, raising their children almost entirely on her own, a quiet, forgotten pillar of support for a man she barely knew, who was engaged in a struggle she could barely comprehend. The cost of his obsession is most starkly illustrated by his life in Japan. During his long periods of exile there, he fell in love and, in 1903, took a Japanese wife, the 15-year-old Otsuki Kaoru. They were married in a secret ceremony and had a daughter, Fumiko, in 1906. But the demands of the revolution were absolute. Shortly after his daughter's birth, Sun left Japan and disappeared back into his clandestine world of fundraising and plotting. He effectively abandoned his Japanese family, He never saw Kaoru again, and he would never truly know the daughter they had together. Kaoru, facing financial hardship and social stigma, was forced to give Fumiko up for adoption. It was a heartbreaking, deeply personal tragedy, a small, intimate sacrifice laid upon the grand altar of national salvation. This raises a haunting, unanswerable question that lies at the heart of Sun Yat-sen's character. Was he a man driven by an unstoppable fate, a mere vessel for the great tide of history, his personal choices and relationships simply driftwood in a historic flood? Or was he a man of extraordinary will whose conscious choices to pursue revolution above all else, to sacrifice family for country, to leave a wife and child behind, were the very acts that bent the course of a nation? He was a man trying to birth a republic, and he could not or would not pay the price required to be a present husband or a loving father. He was not a man who chose between two families. He was a human storm, a force of nature whose personal relationships were simply the unfortunate wreckage left in the wake of his historic passing. It was a choice he made again and again in every city he visited, with every dollar he raised, and with every life, including his own, that he gambled for his magnificent, all-consuming dream. For 16 years, Sun Yat-sen had been the ghost of the revolution, planning, fundraising, and sending men to their deaths in a series of heroic but futile assaults on the Qing monolith. He was the indispensable man, the ideological core and financial engine of the entire enterprise. The revolution, it was assumed, would begin when and where he commanded it. But history is rarely so neat. When the great firestorm finally erupted, it was not the result of a masterfully executed plan. It was sparked by an accident in a city where Sun had little direct influence, by men he had never met, while he himself was half a world away, canvassing for donations in Denver, Colorado. By 1911, the Qing dynasty was a dry forest, waiting for a single stray spark. The authority of the 2.5-year-old Emperor Puyi and his regent was non-existent. The court was paralyzed by corruption and factional infighting. A final fatal blunder lit the fuse. The government, desperate for funds, decided to nationalize the country's major railway lines, a project that had been financed by local gentry and merchants. To add insult to injury, the deal was funded by a massive loan from a consortium of foreign banks, a move seen by the populace as yet another act of selling China out to the imperialists. This triggered the railway protection movement, a wave of mass protests, strikes, and riots, particularly in the vast and populous province of Sichuan. The Qing responded with force, ordering troops to fire on unarmed protesters. The nation was at a boiling point. The seeds of rebellion that Sun and others had been sowing for nearly 2 decades had found fertile ground in the widespread fury of the people. The epicenter of the coming explosion was the sprawling tri-city metropolis of Wuhan, a major industrial and military hub on the Yangtze River. The city was home to a large portion of the new army, the modernized military force the Qing had created to defend itself, ironically using the very tactics and technologies of the West. But this new army was a double-edged sword. Its soldiers were better educated, more worldly, and more exposed to revolutionary ideas than the old imperial troops. Secret revolutionary cells, many inspired by the Tongmenghui but operating independently, had been spreading their propaganda among the disaffected soldiers for years. An uprising was being planned, but the timeline was uncertain. On October 9, 1911, in the Russian concession of the city of Hankou, a revolutionary cell was assembling bombs in their secret headquarters. One of the devices exploded prematurely. The blast was not large, but it was loud enough to attract the police. In the ensuing raid, the authorities discovered the revolutionaries' weapons, flags, and, most damningly, a complete roster of the cell's members, which included a great number of soldiers in the local New Army garrison. For the plotters, the choice was now stark: rise up immediately or wait to be arrested and executed one by one. The next evening, October 10th, a date that would forever be known as Double 10 Day, the revolution began. A junior officer in the Wuchang garrison, fearing discovery, shot his commanding officer. The mutiny spread like lightning. Soldiers seized the main arsenal, turned their guns on their Manchu commanders, and took control of the city. Within 48 hours, the entire Wuhan metropolis was in the hands of the rebels. They were a chaotic, leaderless force, acting out of a desperate mix of self-preservation and patriotic fervor. They needed a figurehead, and they found one in Colonel Li Wenhong, a senior officer who was reportedly dragged out from under his bed, where he was hiding and forced at gunpoint to become the military governor of the new revolutionary government. The Wuchang uprising had succeeded. The news spread across China with astonishing speed. The rebels' telegram to the other provinces was a call to arms. Wuchang has been taken. The Manchus are panicking. Let our Han compatriots rise up and drive out the barbarian thieves. The response was overwhelming. One after another, provinces and major cities declared their independence from Beijing. It was a domino effect of breathtaking speed. The Qing court was powerless to stop the tide. The revolution Sun Yat-sen had spent his entire adult life fighting for had finally come to pass. Born not of his grand design but of a clumsy accident and the spontaneous courage of others. And where was the father of the revolution? He was on a train, making his way through the American heartland. He picked up a newspaper at a stop in Denver and read the stunning headline, "Wuchang occupied by revolutionaries." His initial reaction was not, as might be expected, to rush back to China and take command. His 16 years in the wilderness had taught him that battles were won not just with guns, but with diplomacy and money. He knew the new revolutionary government would be fragile and broke. The Qing, on the other hand, could still secure foreign loans to finance a counterattack. So instead of sailing west to China, Sun sailed east to Europe. He embarked on a critical diplomatic mission, successfully lobbying the British and French governments to remain neutral and, crucially, to deny any further financial assistance to the dying Manchu regime. He was strangling his enemy from afar, ensuring that when he did return, the Republic would have a fighting chance. When Sun Yat-sen finally landed in Shanghai on Christmas Day 1911, he returned not as a wanted rebel, but as a conquering hero. The revolution had a dozen fathers on the ground, but it had only one international symbol. He was the man whose tireless work had laid the ideological foundation, the man whose name was synonymous with the cause of a Chinese republic. His years of exile and his famous London kidnapping had given him a global stature that no other figure could match. In the chaotic scramble to form a new government, he was the consensus choice, the one man who could unite the disparate factions and command the respect of the foreign powers. On January 1st, 1912, in a ceremony held in the former viceroy's Yamen in Nanjing, the ancient southern capital, deliberately chosen to symbolize a break from the Manchu court in Beijing, Sun Yat-sen was inaugurated as the first provisional president of the Republic of China. The farmer's son from Qing had toppled a 2,000-year-old imperial system. It was the absolute dizzying pinnacle of his life. The event was heavy with the symbolism of a new era. The official flag of the new republic was a banner with 5 stripes: red for the Han, yellow for the Manchus, blue for the Mongols, white for the Muslims, and black for the Tibetans, representing a vision of a multi-ethnic nation. The old lunar calendar was abolished in favor of the Western Gregorian calendar, and across the liberated South, men lined up in the streets to have their queues, the long braid forced upon Han men by the Manchus as a symbol of submission, publicly cut off. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated hope. Sun immediately set to work creating the framework of a modern state. He established a cabinet, promulgated a provisional constitution that enshrined principles of separation of powers and civil liberties, and declared China a republic for the people and by the people. He was a whirlwind of energy, a man whose dreams were finally taking tangible form. But the dream was built on a foundation of sand. The Republic of China existed largely on paper. Sun's government in Nanjing was desperately short of funds. The treasury was virtually empty. More importantly, while he held the title of president, he did not command a single loyal army of any significant size. He controlled the revolutionary spirit of the South, but the real military power, the guns, the cannons, and the disciplined, battle-hardened soldiers of the Beiyang army was concentrated in the north. And that power was in the hands of one man, Yuan Shikai. The glorious dawn of the Republic was about to collide with the cold, hard reality of power politics. Sun Yat-sen's presidency, the culmination of his life struggle, would last just 45 days. Yuan Shikai was the most formidable man in China. He was a brilliant administrator, a cunning political operator, and a ruthless military modernizer. He had risen through the ranks of the late Qing, playing a key role in creating the Beiyang army, the only truly modern military force in the empire. He was a man of immense ambition, a master of the double cross, who possessed no fixed loyalty to any ideology other than the expansion of his own power. As a former court official might have lamented in his old age, we thought Yuan was a loyal dog of the dynasty. Then we thought he was a clever servant of the Republic. We were all fools. He served only one master, Yuan Shikai. He was a man of the old world, dressed in the clothes of the new. He could not comprehend a nation without a dragon on the throne. When the Wuchang uprising erupted, the terrified Qing court, which had previously forced Yuan into retirement, recalled him as their last hope. They appointed him prime minister and gave him command of the armed forces, begging him to crush the southern rebellion. Yuan took the job, but he had no intention of saving the dynasty that had scorned him. Instead, he played a masterful double game. He used the Beiyang army to attack the revolutionaries just enough to demonstrate his power, while simultaneously opening secret negotiations with them. He was positioning himself as the indispensable arbiter, the only man who could either save the Qing or destroy them, the only man who could unify the country and prevent a devastating civil war. This placed Sun Yat-sen in an impossible position. He faced a terrible choice. He could refuse to negotiate with Yuan and attempt to fight him. This would almost certainly mean a prolonged and bloody North-South civil war. The newborn republic would be torn apart in its infancy, its resources exhausted, its people subjected to more years of brutal conflict. Such a war would also create a power vacuum, a perfect excuse for foreign powers like Japan to intervene and carve up China for themselves. The alternative was to compromise, to bargain with the devil to save the nation's soul. Sun, the idealist, made a profoundly pragmatic and selfless decision. He believed that the primary goal of the revolution, the overthrow of the Manchus, and the establishment of a republic was paramount. Preserving his own position as president was secondary. He publicly announced that if Yuan Shikai could secure the abdication of the Qing Emperor and pledge his allegiance to the new republic, he, Sun Yat-sen, would resign and nominate Yuan to be his successor. It was the ultimate political gamble. Yuan seized the opportunity. He went to the imperial court in Beijing and presented them with an ultimatum: abdicate peacefully and be granted a generous pension and favorable treatment, or face certain destruction. The isolated and terrified court had no choice. On February 12, 1912, the Empress Dowager Longyu, acting on behalf of the 6-year-old Emperor Puyi, signed the imperial edict of abdication. With a stroke of a pen, 268 years of Qing rule and more than 2,000 years of Chinese imperial history came to a quiet, anticlimactic end. As promised, Sun Yat-sen resigned the presidency. The next day, the Nanjing Assembly duly elected Yuan Shikai as the new provisional president of the Republic of China. Sun believed he had made a necessary sacrifice to achieve unity and prevent bloodshed. He had traded his own power for the survival of the Republic. It would soon become clear that this was a catastrophic mistake. He had not saved the Republic. He had handed it over to its future gravedigger. For a brief, hopeful moment, it seemed Sun's gamble might pay off. Yuan took the oath of office, pledging to devote my utmost to the promotion of the interests of the people. Sun, believing his work was done, stepped back from direct politics, taking on a new role as the nation's chief of railway development. He famously declared that while the political revolution was over, the economic revolution was just beginning. He threw himself into drafting grandiose plans for a national network of railroads to modernize the country. It was the optimistic dream of a man who desperately wanted to believe in the system he had created. But the nightmare began almost immediately. Yuan Shikai had no interest in sharing power or abiding by the democratic principles of the new constitution. He was a dictator in waiting. He refused to move the capital from Beijing to Nanjing, surrounding himself with the loyal guns of his Beiyang army. He began to fill government posts with his own cronies, using intimidation, bribery, and coercion to bend the new National Assembly to his will. The first major challenge to his power came from Sun's own party, the Kuomintang, which had been reorganized from the Tongmenghui. In the winter of 1912 to 1913, China held its first ever democratic parliamentary elections. The KMT, led by the brilliant and charismatic 30-year-old Song Jiaoren, won a landslide victory. Song was a passionate advocate for a cabinet-based system of government that would make the presidency a largely ceremonial role, with real power vested in the parliament and the prime minister, a position he was destined to hold. He was a direct threat to Yuan's authoritarian ambitions. On March 20th, 1913, as Song Jiaoren was waiting for a train at the Shanghai railway station, he was shot twice from behind by a lone assassin. He died 2 days later. An investigation quickly revealed a trail of evidence that led directly back to Yuan Shikai's inner circle. The assassination was a political earthquake. It was a clear and brutal message from Yuan. Democratic opposition would not be tolerated. The murder of Song destroyed Sun Yat-sen's last illusions. He saw Yuan for what he truly was, a traitor to the Republic. He called for a second revolution to punish Yuan and defend the Constitution, but the call was premature. The KMT was a political party, not an army. The provincial governors who had previously supported the revolution were now either loyal to Yuan or unwilling to risk their positions. The Second Revolution of 1913 was a disorganized and short-lived affair, swiftly and brutally crushed by Yuan's Beiyang forces. Sun's dream had turned into a nightmare. His life's work was in ruins. For the second time in his life, he was forced to flee his homeland, escaping to Japan as a political exile. A failure once again. With Sun and the KMT out of the way, Yuan's ambition ran unchecked. He forced the parliament to formally elect him president for a 5-year term, then dissolved it entirely. He rewrote the constitution to grant himself dictatorial powers for life. Then, in a move of breathtaking arrogance that revealed his utter contempt for the Republican ideal, he began preparations to make himself emperor. In late 1915, he graciously accepted a manufactured petition from his supporters and declared the founding of a new imperial dynasty, with himself as the Hongxian emperor. The dragon throne was back, the republic was dead, but Yuan had fatally miscalculated. The idea of a republic, however fragile, had taken root. Restoring the monarchy was a step too far, an insult to all who had sacrificed for the revolution. Widespread condemnation erupted, and crucially, Yuan's own Beiyang military commanders, fearing a loss of their own power, turned against him. Provinces began to secede in the National Protection War. Facing universal opposition, humiliated and isolated, Yuan Shikai was forced to abandon his imperial dream just 83 days after creating it. A few months later, in June 1916, he died of uremia, a broken and reviled man. Yuan Shikai's death did not restore the republic. It shattered it. Without a single strong man to hold the country together, China collapsed into one of the darkest periods of its modern history, the warlord era. The Beiyang generals Yuan had created carved up the nation into personal fiefdoms, fighting endless, pointless civil wars for territory and loot. The central government in Beijing became a hollow puppet, passed between whichever warlord was powerful enough to capture the city. It was a time of utter chaos, of famine, banditry, and untold suffering for the common people. Sun Yat-sen returned from exile to this shattered landscape. He spent his final years as a man possessed, desperately trying to piece his broken dream back together. He established a rival government in his southern power base of Guangzhou, but his authority was precarious, often dependent on the fickle loyalties of local warlords who were happy to use his famous name for their own purposes. He watched in despair as the Western powers, who he had once admired, continued to recognize the phantom government in Beijing and deal with the very warlords who were tearing the country apart. Disappointed by the West and desperate for any ally who would support his cause of national unification, Sun made his final, most consequential, and most controversial strategic pivot. He turned to the Soviet Union. In 1923, he entered into an alliance with the new communist state. It was a purely pragmatic arrangement. The Soviets offered what no one else would: weapons, funding, and expert political and military advisors to help him rebuild the KMT and forge a true party army capable of defeating the warlords. Soviet agents like Mikhail Borodin arrived in Guangzhou and helped reorganize the Kuomintang along disciplined Leninist lines. As part of the deal, members of the small but growing Chinese Communist Party were allowed to join the KMT as individuals, creating the first united front. The crowning achievement of this period was the founding of the Whampoa Military Academy in 1924. This was Sun's last great project, a crucible designed to forge a new type of soldier, an officer corps, loyal not to a general or a region, but to the party and the ideology of the revolution. As commandant of the academy, Sun appointed a young, fiercely ambitious, and fiercely loyal disciple named Chiang Kai-shek. The academy's political department was staffed by communists, including a charismatic young intellectual named Zhou Enlai. In the lecture halls and on the training grounds of Whampoa, the seeds of the next 50 years of Chinese history were sown. The men who would one day conquer China for the nationalists and the men who would one day conquer it for the communists began their careers here, side by side, united for a brief moment under the banner of Sun Yat-sen. But Sun would not live to see what grew from these seeds. By late 1924, he was dying of incurable liver cancer. In a final desperate gesture for peace, he accepted an invitation to travel to Beijing for unification talks with the northern warlords. He knew it was a journey from which he would not return. He died in Beijing on March 12, 1925, at the age of 58. His final whispered words were a plea that encapsulated his entire life struggle: peace, struggle, save China. He left behind a political will, urging his followers to carry on the revolution until the three principles of the people were fully realized. So why does he still matter? Sun Yat-sen is a figure of immense contradictions. He was an idealist forced to make brutal compromises. He was a serial failure whose ultimate vision triumphed. He was a Christian who allied with the Soviet Union. His dream of a strong, prosperous, and democratic China remains in many ways unfinished. Yet he is the one modern Chinese leader who transcends the bitter divide between Taiwan and mainland China, revered by both as Guofu, the father of the nation. He was the man who first dared to dream of a China without an emperor. He failed and failed and failed again, but he never stopped believing. His life is a powerful, timeless lesson that changing the world is a messy, imperfect, and often heartbreaking business. He was the doctor who looked upon a dying dragon and, alone among his generation, had the courage to declare that it must die so that a new nation could be born. He was the physician who prescribed regicide as the only cure, the saint who dreamed of a perfect republic, and the demon who shook hands with hell to achieve it. In the end, the demon's methods created a ghost, and it is the ghost of the saint's dream that still haunts China today.